Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody here to today's talk. My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Center for Professional and Applied Ethics here at UNC Charlotte. Our speaker today is Max Liboiron. She's associate professor of geography at Memorial University in Newfoundland. Before we get on to her talk, I'd like to say a few words about the series the talk is a part of. We've been hosting a series co-sponsored by NC Biotech this year on models of minority inclusion in institutional research. And Max is actually the sixth speaker in that series. We've had Angel Harding, Alex Perlman, Omega Wilson, Pepin Al, and Nikita Shiel-Roll have all spoken before. And I mention that because all of those talks are archived on the center's YouTube channel. To find the YouTube channel, you go to the center's website, which is ethics.uncc.edu. And then up on the upper right-hand corner of the screen, there's one of those little buttons that has like the YouTube logo in it. So I'd invite everyone to catch any or all of those talks at your leisure. Also, I should say that we have one more live event this year. The center is doing a series on disability as well. And we've had 3 speakers so far for that: Rosemary Garland Thompson, Joel Michael Reynolds, and Ashley Hsu. Those talks are archived on the center's YouTube page as well. And then the live talk coming up on April 15th, Kim Q. Hall of Appalachian State University will be doing a talk. So I invite anyone to register for those, to register for that. It's available on the center's webpage. There'll be a link to that. So today it's my special pleasure to welcome Max Liboiron, Associate Professor of Geography at Memorial University in Newfoundland. And she's going to talk to us today about colonialism and citizen science. So Max, all yours.
Thank you. Tanche kia Max Liboiron de Shinakashun, la klibish justien, ikia metine shun. Thank you again. My name is Max Liboiron. My pronouns are they and she. And while I grew up in Lac La Biche in Treaty 6 territory, my Michif family is from Red River. So you might be familiar with land acknowledgements. It's what I just did. They're common in Canada and they're increasingly common in the United States. And what I like about them is that they foreground land relations right at the start. So if we were in a physical room, we could look around and say, who is here? Who is not here? What are the walls surrounding us? What are the architectural styles of those walls? Where is the water in the pipes in the walls coming from? Where is the sewage going to? All of those things are land relations. In a digital space like this, a virtual space, we've still got our pipes, we've still got electricity. So wherever your electricity is coming from and whatever waste that electricity formation is creating, all part of land relations that go into a presentation like this. And because my talks are these days always about land relations, it's a really good way to get started, sort of grounding us. So here's the roadmap for what's going to happen in the next hour or so. Because colonialism is the main analytic through which I will be analyzing citizen science, we're going to get on the same page about what colonialism is. Because colonialism and its boogie term, decolonization, have come to mean a whole spectrum of things, including things that are contradictory. So it's important to get specific in analysis. Then I'll give some examples of colonialism in dominant science and dominant citizen science in particular. But if you're like me and you're invested in what is sometimes or often called citizen science, critique isn't enough, right? You have to move on from critique. So I'm here in part as a scientist who runs a lab called CLEAR, or Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research. And we do plastic pollution research with a variety of non-accredited, meaning non-PhD scientists and forms of expertise. Sometimes that research looks like what's often called citizen science. Sometimes we call it community science. Usually we just call it science. And the reasons we don't use the term citizen science will become clear because some of the baggage that that term has, especially in terms of colonial land relations. So what I'm invested in the lab and in this talk is unsettling dominant science and citizen science to think about an anti-colonial citizen science. So a bibliographic note, some of the talk today draws on a keynote I gave at the Citizen Science Association in 2019. The transcript of that talk is up on the website of the lab, civiclaboratory.nl. I'm also going to read from my new starting next week book, Pollution is Colonialism. It comes out at the end of this month / beginning of May, depending on your time zone. The book is basically a methodological text that talks about how all research, whether it's scientific or non-scientific, which I mean social scientific, sorry, I also do social science, always has land relations, and those can line with or against colonialism. So here's our foray into colonialism. So this is from the book. Colonialism is a way to describe relationships characterized by conquest and genocide. They grant access to colonial and settler access to indigenous land and resources that meet settler and colonial goals, needs, and desires. So colonialism is more than the intent, the identities, the heritages, and the values, say, of settlers and their ancestors. So here's the quick and dirty version of this above my short head. Colonialism is non-indigenous access to land for non-indigenous goals. Now, this is a site-specific colonialism. This is a type of colonialism that's important to articulate is in North America, Canada, and the United States. There are many colonialisms. There are therefore many anti-colonialisms, but they have some similarities about this sort of entitlement and access, which will be the point of this talk. So access to land can mean access to land for property and settlement. It often means that, but it can also mean access to land for scientific research. It can mean conducting beach cleanups on indigenous land without permission or consent, right? It can mean imagining things for land in ways that align with settler and colonial goals, even when those goals are benevolent or well-intentioned. And I would say especially when they're well-intentioned, because that goodness can obfuscate sometimes colonial land relations. This means that environmentalism and environmental science are not the opposite of colonialism. My book talks about this a lot. So many environmental historians and theorists have shifted their understandings of environmentalism to way back before the back to the land movements of the 30s, 50s, 60s, 70s in the United States, all the way back to earlier imperial archiving, cultivation, control, and science across the globe by colonial scientists and managers. And they're responsible for mitigating environmental destruction and sort of foregrounding what would be today called environmental values so that colonies might flourish. And these are the folks that some authors call, quote, the pioneers of environmentalism, where environmentalism is police action, inseparable from Western concepts and attitudes of how to best organize and govern land, end quote. And that quote is from Richard Grove, not this book, this green book here. It's from a piece called Origins of Environmentalism. But this isn't a historical issue. This continues to happen. So I've talked about access to beaches for shoreline studies of plastics, for instance. In the case of citizen science, I get 2 to 3 emails a year, and it's actually increasing, from citizen science groups who are sailing around the world who want to gather plastic pollution samples for me to analyze, usually for free, which makes sense because they're doing it for free too, citizen scientists, and I'll talk about that soon. 100% of those cases go through indigenous land claim areas, especially Nunatsiavut in this country. And 100% of them don't know they need permits to take things from indigenous land. And I have no idea how many actually get those permits. So the point is that colonialism isn't a single type of thing with a single set of techniques that always aligns, say, with capitalism and against environmentalism. I'm not saying environmentalism and environmental sciences are inherently bad or colonial. I'm saying that something good in one way can still very much accomplish colonialism, be colonial. And that's why I argue that analyzing things from a colonial lens is really important. So accessing land for science is one manifestation of colonial land relations, but there's another in terms of knowledge systems. So the dominant scientific knowledge system was and still is articulated as a reason for colonialism and imperialism. And this is from the book again, quote, the idea that science and technology were among the gifts that Western imperial powers brought to their colonies was an integral part of the discourse of the, quote, civilizing mission. And I'll move my head so you can see this picture in a minute. Christianity, residential schools, dominant science, all different techniques through which colonizers claim to bring light to the darkness of primitivism while simultaneously maintaining a difference between the colonized and the colonizers. So even as the colonizer brought into Christianity or brought into dominant science, they're always like mini-me's, right? They're never quite scientists, they're always apprentices, right? That sort of relationship. So here we have a picture of an explorer who is so white he's gray, and he's got a sextant, and he's approaching what someone's idea of an Indigenous woman is, who's naked and on a hammock, as we are, and she's gesturing towards his tool. Take all the innuendos you'd like out of this piece. So since the Enlightenment, the goal of dominant science has been what science historian Lorraine Daston calls European self-portraiture, which is basically making mini Europes, right, through imperialism, but also mini Europeans, right, sort of citizenry of the empire. So this involves, so the dominant science, right, dominant science, which is sometimes called Western science, but different. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like. Dominant science involves the idea that a single knowledge system becomes the touchstone for all other forms of knowledge systems, right? And those other ones are mined for their usefulness, right? Local knowledge was essential to proper successful colonization and imperialism, right? How to deal with malaria, how to deal with climate, domestication of plants, cultivation, these sorts of things. But it also sort of dismisses, erases, and demotes those forms of knowledge at the same time, even as it eats them up. And those other forms of knowledge become, you know, late, quaint, cute, curious, underdeveloped, and certainly consumable for settler and colonial desires, regardless of whether those are well-intentioned. So citizen science uses some of the same frameworks as imperial and colonial science in talking about making proper colonial subjects. So here we go. People talk about, I'm going to stand where the lady is, it's fitting. So people talk about citizen scientists benefiting from citizen science because they learn about the world through science in a new way that they didn't have access before, implying a deficit model that they need science to sort of show them their neighborhood in various ways. People often talk about how it makes people more scientifically literate and better citizens, right? Better citizens of the world if they have this dominant scientific knowledge. Also, there is always the conversation how citizen sciences provide real value in terms of data and sometimes analysis, right? Sometimes citizen scientists do rote analysis for larger projects. Of course, they don't have decision-making roles in these projects, and they're always sort of the data grunts. And always citizen sciences are just short of the real deal. They're never full scientists. You cannot enter dominant science through citizen science, right? And so those folks are never deserving of credit, funding, decision-making roles, or the ability to critique or change a project. They're always in the waiting room of the main project. So dominant science, citizen science projects like dominant science and its colonization assume a lack of accreditation is also a lack of expertise. And that means that citizen scientists are always play learning or learning as playing, right? They're always essentially, or they're remote sensors, right? These technical apparatuses whose main agency, whose only agency from the view of citizen science is to inscribe data to pass on to accredited scientists. This is why inclusion is not the opposite of colonialism, right? Including more and different types of people into dominant sciences, including through citizen science, just feeds the dominant system and brings people into a dominant system without changing it, right? The term of art in a lot of Indigenous conversation is inclusion into empire. And that's what a lot of like science camps, coding camps, these sorts of things are supposed to include more people into the dominant system. And it's still very much part of the civilizing process, whose terms are very much based on the often benevolent desires, values, and cultures of the dominant knowledge group. Right, so if you look at Girls Who Code, if you look at, you know, Indigenous science camps, it's part of the civilizing, the uplifting, the bringing the light, the making people better and more successful citizens are very much still part of that discourse. So what would an anti-colonial citizen science look like then? You've got your critique, but what's next? So I'm going to talk a little bit, to talk about an anti-colonial citizen science, I'm going to talk a little bit about the citizen part of citizen science. That's the part of the term that denotes the non-accredited researcher, right, where their diversity is or could be, given the pale, male, and stale nature of dominant STEM, which we're, I think, all well acquainted with. It's where the wiggle room might be, right, which is why I sort of look at it. You're likely fluent in critiques of citizen science, the citizen part, right, probably also because of this series. Citizenry, of course, interpolates subjects as part of the state. So immigrants, refugees, etc., just don't have that. But also, nor do people like Black, Indigenous people of color, trans folks, Asian Americans, queers, sex workers, lots of people who are denied basic rights even when they are citizens. They are not, of course, interpolated by the state as citizens. I'm not going to belabor this point. We know there are lots of problems with the term. But after I had accepted the invitation to the talk, but well before I knew exactly what I would talk about, I was reading a book called Native Studies Keywords. And in that, oh, here it is. There we go. I was reading this book, and this book has a section on sovereignty, because sovereignty is a really important term, organizing term for a lot of different Indigenous groups that refers to our right and our ways of governing ourselves and our lands outside of the settler state. And it's got many different and competing definitions, even within sort of Indigenous conversations. But one of the ones in this book is Leanne Simpson's keyword for sovereignty that she defines as, quote, the place where we all live and work together. And so here's what she says about sovereignty. The concept is as diverse as the people and the land, right? But there's some things in common. She's talking from an Anishinaabe perspective, but she's talking about how sovereignty is about good relationships, responsibilities, respect for different scales of self-determination, right, the self and the collective, and honoring diversity. And when sovereignty is practiced, that power comes from a generated consensus and a respect for dissent rather than a top-down authoritarian power. So when I was reading this, I was thinking, well, what would a citizenry under this sort of concept of sovereignty look like, right? A citizen would have to practice these good relations, would have to be responsible, right, to land and humans, non-humans, all that sort of stuff, have a deep respect for self-determination, right, these sorts of things. So before we go further, I want to flag that I'm not saying that non-Indigenous people or even non-Leanne Simpson people should take up Indigenous sovereignty as per this definition and like take it up as their model for citizenry or citizen science, right? Remember our definition of colonialism is access to Indigenous land. That includes cosmologies, thoughts, philosophies, legal traditions for non-Indigenous goals and desires. So we'd have to back off that a little bit. But this is a key issue that actually happens in my lab CLEAR because we have probably about a third Indigenous folks and 2/3 settlers or people who are neither settlers nor Indigenous. And we talk a lot about people's very different and specific obligations to land, to colonialism, to history, to legacies, to now, to power relations, and how we have to take those things up differently, right? So one of the ways we talk about sort of this model of sovereignty that Leanne Simpson talks about, or good relations is sometimes the go-to phrase, is to talk about humility, which is a value that is less open to creepy appropriation. So I'm going to read a little bit from the lab book, and here's me in the lab in a very moodily lit sort of way to get you in the mood for reading from a lab book. Our lab book starts with a series of value statements that orient our work, and humility is one of our 3 main core values. So here's from the lab book, quote, "Humility comes from the understanding that our world is interconnected. Being humble means that we, as members of larger groups of humans and non-humans, recognize that we are not singular nor superior in our knowledge, in our perspective, in our experience, or in our social position. It means that we are connected to others, whether we want to be or not." Hang on, I have to figure out which side of this to move to. Everything's backwards when you're a weather forecaster like this. Humility is about being ready to change our minds and our actions, being responsive to context, and stepping back and listening instead of taking up space. Things that are not always valued in academia or in research. And it means being mindful of our surroundings so that we adapt to that and our context instead of forcing context and situations to adapt to us. So not the terra nullius sort of mindset. It's about recognizing that one still has much to learn regardless of your age, your education or number of degrees, or your lived experience, and about remaining teachable no matter what you already know. A humble person understands that there are many ways to know things, many different forms of knowledge, and recognizes the limits of a single way to know things, including dominant science. Now, this all sounds super serious, but a good sense of humor also really helps. So humility is not the same as modesty. This is also from the lab book. Modesty usually means not talking about how fantastic you are or celebrating your achievements so you don't elevate yourself over others. Humility shares this issue of not elevating yourself over others. But we would argue that if you're modest, then you're not acknowledging or celebrating the larger group of people and relationships that you're part of that were absolutely crucial to your successes and achievements. Right? So you do an injustice to yourself in those relations by practicing modesty, which is the erasure of your connections, rather than humility, which is being beholden to those connections and bragging about them too, potentially. All right, so what does humility in science look like? Here's an example that you're not meant to read. It's just sort of to get the mappy, webby situation. So this is a mappy, webby map that we made in the lab when we were talking about authorship for a paper that was a long-term project. And so the people involved in the project were asked to talk about like what they did, what forms of labor, but also who else they were talking to and working with. And so that way things like librarians and IT and service animals and other folks got onto the board because they were also part of the research project, even if they didn't understand themselves as researchers. And those folks got these pink little stars, people whose labor and expertise and relations were definitely part of the project, but who were not beholden to the project. Purple stars are for folks who did work in the project and are beholden to the paper, have specific responsibilities to it. So that means a couple of things. First of all, this process means that more people end up on this board and more people are recognized as being part of a project than usually are in dominant science. For us, that often includes the janitors, which I'll talk about in a minute. It also means that sometimes the people who have the pink stars move into purple stars, and we get more authors, right? As well as more people in the acknowledgements and more recognition of our relations. It also crucially highlights an important part of humility, which is recognizing and citizen science and a humble citizen science, which is recognizing forms of scientific knowledge production that don't usually get noticed or credited. Right, so I'll talk about citizen science in a moment, but a really crucial form of knowledge production in CLEAR is cleaning. So we study plastic pollution, and one of the problems with plastics is that they are everywhere. It's the main component of house dust or lab dust. It comes out of your hair and off of your clothes. And so if people aren't really good at cleaning and maintaining like archives of cleaning, you can have a sample where you can't tell where the plastics came from, and now you don't have any kind of sample. The janitors, the cleaners in the university are part of this work. They're not allowed to wear fleece in our lab because fleece just loses particles like houses on fire. And so they're always in our acknowledgement system because they're always in our knowledge acknowledgements because they keep our science valid, essentially, through their work. There are other types of labor that are very common in scientific knowledge production that also are not usually credited, things like organizing meetings, doing the emotional labor of collaboration, which is enormous, cleaning and stewarding and managing data. This is important from an equity perspective because the folks who do that labor tend to be junior, right? Folks without degrees, women, Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? These sorts of folks who consistently get the fuzzy lollipop in STEM. So in a humble lab, which is one way of talking about an anti-colonial lab, you wouldn't subscribe to the idea of underbaked scientific subjects, right? More people would get the purple stars, more forms of labor would get the purple stars. You don't think that accredited science is the only or the always best knowledge system in the world, and that knowledge of cleaning, which a lot of my male undergrads do not possess, is also a valid form of making meaning and value and knowledge. And also we don't extract labor. You credit people, such as with authorship. It can be done, including in citizen science. So what I have behind me is an author list of over 1,000 authors on a paper about flies, fruit flies, and genetic mutations stuff. I don't do genetics. It has over 1,000 authors. Almost all of them don't have degrees because they're undergraduates. Here, I'll move my head away from the tweet. Right, so it is definitely possible within dominant science. So I'm not talking about leaving dominant science. I'm talking about changing dominant science because it's already this is already happening. Here's another example. This is a 2015 paper on the very fancy Higgs-Boson particles out of CERN, which is in Geneva and has the largest particle accelerator in the world. We have here over 300 authors. This author list ends at the letter B, right? So very long, and some of the authors are dead, right? So doing research like this took many generations literally, but instead of just citing or acknowledging elders and older folks who had contributed to this research, they were full authors, right? So when I talk to accredited research, right, people with PhDs, oh, hang on, sorry, my dogs are protecting my house from the mail carrier. There we go. There we go, back to programming. Sorry if there is barking. I hope it is quieter for you than it is for me. There are 4 dogs. So when I talk to accredited researchers about this, a lot of people have big feelings about these giant author lists, right? And what they're giving up with this author list. And I ask them, what are you giving up? Because the answer isn't nothing. One of the things that is being given up is the scarcity economy that maintains elitism and the privileged one-sided access to land and knowledge, right? And of course, we can argue that there isn't actually naturally a scarcity economy here. It's built. One of the main things I talk about in my book is a resource relationship as a colonial relationship, not just to land, but the logic start going to people, to labor, to spirit, all sorts of things, where a resource relationship is built not only on a unidirectional flow of value from the resource to the person, but also that resource becomes reserved and blocked from producing other types of value, right? Heidegger talks about this for all the philosophers in the room, standing reserve. So you take coal out of the ground, not to be coal and to act coalish, but to sit in a lump until unspecified future use for that resource comes into being. So it's reserved, right, for that use and can't do other things. So authorship is one great way to give credit and shift that resource relationship, but money is better. So full disclosure, I'm being paid. There's like a dog party outside my house. I hope you can't hear it. They're very happy though. So full disclosure, I'm being paid $500 to give this talk, $500 US for people not in the United States. And that's because I'm an expert and I'm being recognized as such with the cash. And there are people in my lab covering for me because I am not currently doing my lab work and I'm paying them at the union rates. And in fact, I pay everyone who does scientific work for me, including citizen scientists. So one of the main reasons I don't usually identify as a practitioner of citizen science is because a lot, though not all, of citizen science projects are based on this sort of resource and scarcity and honestly a sacrifice economy, right? Where value continually accrues to people with more privilege, usually accredited scientists, and it's usually drawn from folks with less privilege. Now, some citizen science projects might have citizen scientists that are old white guys who own their own castles and have marvelous pensions, but mine certainly don't. I work mostly with fish harvesters and people who rely on wild food or sustenance harvesting. Because we have pretty successful citizen science projects in the land, and I don't know whether my bunny ears were around successful or citizen science, but let's say both. So anyway, a lot of people come to us because we have successful citizen science projects, and they often want to diversify people in those, right? Bring in people with less privilege, Black, Indigenous, people of color, younger folks, folks in the Arctic, right? And they want to basically draw in people with less privilege than them to do free work for them. And that tends to reproduce inequity, and that gets called diversity. And so diversity is not the opposite of colonialism. right? Diversifying citizen science is a way to recruit into empire, right? Include into empire. Now, of course, when I talk about this with a lot of other people who do citizen science, they say, no, but the citizen scientists are getting something out of it. They want to be there. They learn about the world through science. It makes them better citizens. But we've heard this before, right? This goes right back into many of the frameworks of imperialist science and dominant knowledge systems. So when I talk about sacrifice economies or resource economies in citizen science or resource relationship to land and labor, I'm not talking about people's individual choices to opt in or out of project, or even individual citizen science principal investigators like myself wiggling things around a bit. I'm talking about a structure of power that consistently ensures value flows in a certain direction, same way every time, and that maintains this differential status between accredited and mere citizen scientists. The thing about dominant systems is that they overdetermine what makes sense, what is inherited as common sense, what is inherited as the things you do, whether you can pay people or not, just the imagination of what systems you would have to pay people. By the way, in a university at Memorial, it's very easy to pay citizen scientists, super easy. I've paid 8-year-olds, no problem. They don't have a social insurance number, not a problem, right? But just thinking that that might be insurmountable comes out of these inheritances. So giving people credit, especially money, is one way to be a more humble, less colonial, less resource-oriented citizen science or dominant science. Another way to be an anti-colonial humble citizen science project or dominant science or dominant research, doesn't have to be citizen science, would include citizen scientists or non-accredited people as decision makers, right? As per the last point here. So this picture here is of me and Jess. Me, I look like this. Wait, hang on. This is really hard. There we go. There we go. I'm the one doing this. Jess is the other person. We're at a community meeting for our project in the small fishing village that Jess is from, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's called Community Peer Review. But in my book, I talk about how obligations to land and community without locals is not only weird and unlikely, it's probably impossible. So every major citizen science or community science or locally situated research project we do, we always hire locals, and they are in decision-making roles as opposed to data grunt roles, and they have autonomy and decision-making power over how the project rolls out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this looks like and why you might want to do it, besides like the goodness of your inclusive heart. And that's because it makes better research. So one of the main forms of data collection that we do is we gather guts, scientific term, from fish and other animals caught for food. And the protocol I have for gathering that is we walk out to wharfs in our little blazers from the university, and we approach fish harvesters who are gutting their catch on the wharfs, and we say, hello, my name is, and I am from Memorial University, and we are doing a project, and we would like the guts of your fish, please. When Jess does that, it looks a lot different. She walks up to the fish harvesters and she says, hey, Bill. And Bill says, hey, Jess. And that's the first major difference. The second thing is, when I would ask for fish harvesters to take the guts out of the fish, just asks for their carcasses. So once the fish harvester is done filleting, they just toss her the fish and she looks after it, after the carcass. And that means that she does the work and the labor of taking the guts out, but she also cuts out the cheeks and the britches. And these are delicacies here in Newfoundland and Labrador, but they're often hard to get at, and people don't often take the time to get at these niggly wiggly delicious meats. And so she gives those back to the fish harvesters. And then when it comes to payment or certificates or having those fish harvesters know about their data, they know Jess, they know her parents, they know where her live. We still keep records, but the webs of accountability get tighter and we become more accountable to them, which is a very important ethic, I would say, in humility and in anti-colonialism and being accountable to place. So this whole setup, just being a regular researcher, makes better science, both under the dominant interpretation, because we also get more samples when Jess does it. And it also makes better responsibility. It's more reciprocal, less extractive, and we're more accountable to locals. which is all about humility. I forgot to show you the picture of fish guts. Maybe you don't want to see fish guts. That's okay. This is a cod. And these hands are science hands because they are gloved, and fish harvesters don't use gloves. That's how you can tell. So this photo here, let's see, I'll get on the right side of the room again. This photo is of a community meeting. And one of the questions I am often asked by my colleagues is how we get so many people at these community meetings. So this is in a town in their darts hall, and the number of people in this village are roughly the number of seats in this room. They're pretty full. So there are three answers to how we get so many butts in seats. The first is because we've hired local people like Jess, and honest to God, people are there to see them, not us. Second, we've done this enough times that during the discussions we have in community meetings, people ask us questions that we don't know the answers to, and those become our research questions. And I don't think I've worked on a question that isn't a community question in about 7 years. And so people are waiting for us and our answers, and we're late because academic time is slower than community time. And third, and most importantly for us in this conversation, is these meetings are not knowledge dissemination or research communication meetings. These are community peer review. So here's what community peer review is from the book. Quote, if colonialism is a mode of domination where settlers and colonial forces have access to land for their goals, then community peer review is a way to cock-block that entitlement. Traditional academic peer review is about judging knowledge, ensuring its validity, and deciding whether or not it is good enough to circulate or get published. CLEAR's protocol for community peer review is very similar, but we have a different set of peers, which have a different idea of quality and validity. But the procedure is basically the same in both cases. You talk about what you did, why you did it, what your results are, and can you publish this, please? And the reviewers have the right to change your research, to ask you to improve certain things, and accept or deny your publication. That tends to freak people out. There's a term of art in Indigenous methodologies and anti-colonial methodologies called ethnographic refusal. Audra Simpson works on it a lot. I'm going to be quoting from her a lot in a minute. The term refusal in this kind of research context refers to ethical and methodological considerations about how and whether findings should be shared within academia at all, which is actually not a given, right? Especially through Humboldt and anti-colonial relations. This assumed access to other places, to other knowledge, to samples is what's at stake here. Researchers often encounter information that might be intensely personal, or fundamentally contextual, or sacred, or intended only for certain people, or needs to be earned, or can cause harm, or it's just none of their damn business, right? Offering refusal is part of ensuring research is accountable to its relation, including its land and its community relations. In refusal, rather than, quote, the terms of accommodation being determined by and in the interest of the hegemonic partner in the relationship, end quote, that's Audra Simpson from Mohawk Interruptus. Instead, it's fish harvesters and villagers that set those terms of how and whether research that impacts their community, that is about their community, that is about their food, how it should be conducted, how it should occur, how or with it should occur, and how and if it should circulate. So this sort of practicing refusal and opportunities for refusal keeps community knowledge and lands and food from being in a resource relationship to researchers. And it's really hard not to be in that relationship. So that means refusal is an affirmation and a form of repair just as much as it's a denial, because it's, quote, not just a no, but a redirection to ideas otherwise unacknowledged and unquestioned, end quote. That's Audra Simpson again. It can highlight and address the strained relationships, say, between academics and communities. It can realign research values to local needs or benefits and protocols. And of course, it brings attention to the entitlement, this idea that research are entitled to land and samples and local knowledge, etc. Local labor. So communities have the right to self-determination and about how they're represented in research. Remember, self-determination, collective and individual, is part of the other Simpsons, Leanne Simpson's definition of sovereignty and good citizenry, right? So as a researcher, I have stakes in the research, but communities have rights, and rights trump stakes. Stakes are not more important, right? My tenure file is not more important than a community's right to self-determination. So those are just a few examples. We're kind of coming up on the end here to your listening timer. Those are a couple of examples of what a more humble, less colonial approach to citizen science and research might be like. The people in this room are the people we got fish guts from, are the citizen scientists, and they have decision-making power as a collective. There are a lot of different ways to do an anti-colonial or a humble citizen science or research generally. This is just one way. And no matter what your discipline is or type of research is, a lot of these hold. So because there are a lot of different colonialisms and different anti-colonialisms, I would say that to do anti-colonial research, you just have to hit a few specific notes. It would be the opposite of entitlement. Entitlement to do research, entitlement to data, entitlement to land, entitlement to knowledges, entitlement to labor. It would be the opposite of governing by hegemonic powers and interests, including benevolent goals and interests and values. It would be the opposite of extractive or resource relationships. So there would be more flow of value where the value is determined by both parties and not just the more hegemonic party. And it would be more structural as opposed to individual opt-in, opt-out. It would question the ideas of inclusion and diversity as inherent goods and recognize that these sorts of goods can also cause harms. And it would be the opposite of demoting, erasing, or not crediting, or babifying, what is that called? Infantilization of other types of knowledge that don't have degrees and haven't been through academia, or maybe have but don't have degrees. So I do think that citizen science is a potential place to do this kind of structural work, because structurally the citizen part of citizen science already points to how it's got half a foot out the door out of the academy and provides some potential wiggle room for making different structures. I hope this is useful in those efforts. Again, I don't want to focus just on individual efforts of PIs. That's sort of like anti-racism, right? If individuals just read more Black authors, we're not going to end Black racism today. It's not about individual work, although individual work is nothing to sneeze at. It's about structural things that change structures and institution and what counts as common sense and just the way things seem to go and what is easier and what is harder and what is impossible to imagine. That's the level of change that would be required for an anti-colonial citizen science and otherwise. So thank you for having me and the invitation and listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we have a fair amount of time that we can spend on questions. I don't know if people unmute themselves or if they send chats to me. But either of those is okay with me. So let's open the floor.
Can people use the chat?
They can definitely chat to me.
Okay, they can chat to you.
I was messing up the interpreter windows and the pinning stuff earlier on. So I know I can receive chats.
Okay, excellent. I can't, so I'll go through Gordon.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so the first question, do you see there being a distinct difference between PAR and anti-colonial community science, or should they be interwoven?
So PAR, which is participatory action research, it takes up some of the same goods as citizen science, but a little bit differently in that it, for people who aren't familiar, in that it says people who don't have degrees can do legit research, and that includes high school students or whatever, usually working with a principal investigator from academia to do research collectively. It can be anti-colonial, but it is not, and nothing ever is automatically anti-colonial. So I've seen PAR that assumes access to Indigenous land for anti-colonial goods, or sorry, anti-capitalist goods, or inclusivity of young people's knowledge, still using access to Indigenous land for that. There's a great piece in everything's on my desk today. It's because I never clean my desk. There's this book called critical and indigenous methodologies. And there's a piece in here called Feminisms from Unthought Locations. And one of its main premises is this idea that anti-colonial methodologies or decolonial methodologies, which are different in my view, need to be interrogated for new power relations. And this goes back to the introduction of what I was saying, is that different forms of good can obfuscate how they are also doing other types of harm simultaneously. So that's important to note. I think things like PAR, participatory action research, have great potential to do anti-colonial work, but it's not a given. That's the too long didn't read version.
Thanks. So could you talk more about the distinction between dominant and Western science?
Sure. There's a huge footnote in my book about this. Basically, Western, the idea of Western is a term of art to refer to a very specific, very homogeneous, or not homogeneous, heterogeneous bunch of culture that sort of trace its lineages back to the ancient Greeks, and those philosophies and ideas of matter and science is heavily influenced by Christianity, Islam and Judaism in terms of knowledge system, makes its way through Europe, has a giant pacha during the Enlightenment, and becomes dominant through various forms. But not all, and that's Western. And I often find people conflate Western with colonial. So yeah, Western powers were also very often colonial powers, but not only, right? There are all sorts of colonial powers that are not Western. And so people, when I was an ethics officer, people would be like, well, doing paperwork is colonial. Like doing my ethics paperwork to do indigenous ethics is colonial. I'm like, no, paperwork might be Western, but any paperwork that doesn't assume you get access to indigenous land is not colonial. So it can be Western and not colonial at the same time. There are lots of Western sciences that are not dominant also, midwifery, alchemy, various things that are considered frou-frou now are Western but not dominant. So specificity in those terms, I think, are useful. That's why I use dominant.
Thanks. So how can we make this approach to traditional scientists with closed minds, and how can we motivate them to change the structure with this approach?
We don't waste your time. I don't subscribe to the hearts and minds model. I don't think you can change people's values very easily. And I come to this through when I used to be a professional recycling infrastructure person. You can try really hard and run campaigns to get people to recycle, or you can just get rid of all the trash cans and make sure everyone sorts. Then it doesn't matter what they think, they're sorting. So I take a very similar approach. It's part of why I've become an administrator. I'm not right now, but I have been in the past. Because if you sort of make the hallways with certain doors and not other doors, people got to work through those. Yeah, I've written a piece called, something about against awareness and for scale. That's what it's called. That sort of talks about this philosophy. It's not just mine, but talks about these sort of scalar and infrastructural elements as being the main areas to put efforts for change, as opposed to like awareness, hearts and minds, that sort of stuff. I do have disagreements with my elder, who's a real hearts and minds kind of guy, but I'm an infrastructure kind of person. So yeah. You are muted, Gordon.
One more time. Now I'm unmuted. So what's the difference between decolonial and anti-colonial?
So there are many types of colonialism. So theoretically, there are also many types of decolonization and anti-colonialism. The reason I don't say decolonial, because today everything in the kitchen sink, you can decolonize your syllabus, which does not change land relations. You can decolonize your diet, which does not change industrial farming. You can decolonize your left shoe, which does not change how you walk, right? So that's part of why I don't use the term decolonization. I come out of a tradition that is very similar to Eve Tuck and Wang Yang when they say decolonization means repatriating land and life. And that's a definition that comes out of this kind of place. And so if you're not repatriating land, doing land back, then I think then you might be doing inclusion or diversification or these other things, but probably not decolonization. There are other traditions of decolonization, especially out of South America and different parts of Africa, about cognitive decolonization. That's not my place, right? I know less about that, and I subscribe to that less because I'm in a settler occupied territory. So yeah, I think too, anti-colonialism has a much broader range. So sometimes people are like, well, how do I give land back? And there are ways to do that, but there are ways to be not an asshole too that are anti-colonial while you figure out how to give land back. So it's the bigger tent, and it can handle more things, right? A queer science is more likely to be an anti-colonial science, probably isn't a decolonial science, right? These sorts of things. I have huge sections in my book about this, where I like argue with myself because I'm a little on the fence on some of it.
Cool. So, one thing I noticed, I'm just reading the chat, of course. One thing I'm noticing a lot is different large-scale projects changing their terminology from citizen science to community science without necessarily shifting their project structures. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, my thoughts are that sucks. That's not cool. So when I said that sometimes I would say this, I would identify as doing citizen science. Increasingly, I was like, no, community science. But now community science is also heavily appropriated, and it has the exact same sort of relations. And so now we just say science, and we just pay people, unless we need money, and then we'll use various other terms to leverage that, because we need the money to pay people. So yeah, I think that, that's really appropriation of resistance is like how dominant systems feed themselves, right? Whether it's capitalism or community science or whatever it is. So we're attuned to that move.
So you describe a community peer review process, which, like academic peer review can lead to refusal, right? So have you encountered situations where community reviewers come to different conclusions about agreeing and refusing, and how do you address those tensions?
Yeah, well, so have you guys with published papers in reviewer 1, 2, and 3, who sometimes don't agree, right? So you wend your way through it. And in a community, this question hasn't come up, but it will or should, and that's that communities aren't homogenous groups that agree, and who is in or out of the community is also sort of not given. Although hiring local people really help find the blurry edges on that. And that's part of why we do it. I'd like to make sure we're not missing people. But also, a lot of the work I do comes from a very specific set of skills. And one of my sets of skills is that I am trained in consensus-based decision-making. And I've been in scenarios where we have literally 200 people, and we have been able to come to consensus decisions with people who certainly don't share values or agree on common grounds, on most common grounds, right? So I would use those skills. And I feel like there's always a proposal, even if the proposal is come back next week, come back next week, come back next week, until we get it right. You can reach some kind of consensus, and we always have. Yeah. And there's also things like the precautionary principle, where like if there's enough disagreement, well then no.
So do you think a voluntary/unpaid role in science is ever appropriate?
Sure, if you have a castle of your own. The problem with unpaid internships is that they consistently let those who are ready float to the top, and consistently those who don't have the privilege to work for free don't show up to them, which is a huge way. And in the arts, this is super obvious. And it just skews the profession for generations. And if you can't pay folks, then I come from a poor background, and when someone asks me to work for free, I feel I have feelings about that. And where I come from, you don't ask people to work for free. You would never ask a worker to work for free. That comes out of a very specific set of cultures and privileges, and that's part of what I'm taking up here. Yeah.
So on a different topic, how do you include relationality with non-humans in your lab?
So some of that isn't for public consumption, because some of that is based on Métis, what's called sometimes natural law, or first instructions, and that's not for everybody. But we do have animal respect protocols. One of the things is that we never kill for science. We kill for food and scavenge for science. So none of our samples, all of our samples have been eaten, is the easiest way to put that. Eaten by someone. Sometimes it's us. So that's, for instance, one of the relations, but also we work to think about humility in terms of not just the animals that are specimens, but also the spiders who live in the lab, right? And this sort of stuff. Some of that is in our lab book, some of it is in my book, but most of it isn't for public consumption because it's not universal. Sorry, that is an unsatisfying but true answer.
Thanks. So maybe you could more generally talk about how one might bumble through the learning of anti-colonial relations, methods, and approaches when harm might be unintentionally done and apologies needed.
Yep, so two things. First, learn how to apologize real good. Most people aren't very good at it. Our lab book includes an entire section on apology that comes out of restorative justice. You can look this up. It's on the internet. The second thing I would say is do your homework on your own terms in your room, in your closet, wherever it is you do your homework, and do your readings, and don't email me for something you could Google, or don't ask Black, Indigenous, and people of color to do that homework for you. And people sort of know this. And after you've done a certain amount of homework, you can join the conversation in a way that is more reflexive and more fluent in the terms. And at that point, then just have your apologies ready. And I have to have my apologies ready. So one of the things that's been a hugely important impact on my concepts about colonization and decolonization is I'm Métis, and I am nowhere near my homelands. And I work with a lot of Inuit folks, and Inuit are nothing like Métis. And I have been so rude so many times using Indigenous ethics coming out of a Métis framework that are just really inappropriate in a Inuit framework, right? So even everyone's going to be making the mistakes. Everyone's going to be doing the apologies.
Maybe as a follow-up then, does your book or other writings include suggestions about including an anti-colonial framework in science education that is established state universities for those of us not in research settings?
No, so my book doesn't talk about education in specific. I'm looking to see if the book is handy. Nope. But there are lots of people who write about this. Megan Bang writes about this all the time. George Kahate writes about this extensively. Donald, what's Donald's last name? Donald, who's Métis, writes about this all the time. I'll remember his name in the middle of the night. There are lots of folks who write about de and anti-colonial work in education, especially, and then there's also folks like out of Africa who write about it because cognitive and language colonization is sort of a first step in a lot of those places. So it's a very well-developed literature in which I'm not an expert, but it's out there.
So, terminological question. So, question is noticed that the field has been moving away from the term citizen science lately due to a lot of reasons, many of which you elaborated on today. So, recognizing that umbrella terms are not always easy to agree upon or warranted, but in presenting this kind of work to others who are not familiar with it, they can be a helpful shorthand. And it's something that this person's program is struggling with. So do you recommend using a term like non-accredited or something else to describe it?
So I don't think it matters what term you use as long as you explain it. So that's why when I talk about colonialism, I give a little definition and then people can be like, oh, that's what we're talking about. If I call it purple on Tuesday, that's fine. So yeah, I mean, there are issues with no matter what term you come up with, there will be issues, right? So the problem with centering non-accreditation or unaccredited is you've just recentered accredited and then und the people, right? Deficited the people. But it is maybe more specific in certain contexts than citizen, right? So I think one of the important things about humble research is that there is never a universal, and place-based relations are always place-based, will dictate a lot of what does and doesn't make sense, flows and doesn't flow. And so it depends on where you are and what the discipline is. If calling it unaccredited or non-credited science is freaking radical in the field because you're working with a bunch of physicists, knock yourself out. Where I come from, that would be really rude calling an elder like unaccredited or something, right? So yeah, I don't think there's a universal answer. And I think you just explain what you mean and make it fit the relations.
So this is just a comment that speaking about anti-colonial science is reminding economic models using similar principles in the decentralization and community involvement in economic model based on systems change. So it's called apparently the Donut Economics Action Lab. Sorry, I have to read.
Yeah, so donut economics, someone asked me a question about this at another talk the other day. So apparently it's the cutting edge of the Q&A to ask about donut economics, and I learned what it was then. And it's sort of like a spaceship Earth, and I might be getting this wrong because I was educated through a Q&A, where there's sort of a threshold idea. So instead of the very wealthy and the very poor, you end up going in the middle. It's still a universal theory that is supposed to roll out across place and space. And again, the premise of everything is that different places are always different, and there will never, ever be a universal threshold, which is what donut is based on, or concept of good or value. And so anytime there is a solution that is universal, I always have to say no, no matter what it is. Doesn't mean donut has to be, but yeah.
So I suspect this question is actually shared by several people. So how do you frame research proposals for funding? So community members are part of the articulating research questions, among other things. How does that work on the grant application?
So, you know, I can invite people to write grant applications with me, but no one really wants to, and that's not payment. That's nobody's idea of a good time. So it's kind of a cheeky offer. And that's an idea of like including someone into like a shitty and violent space. So I tend to do a lot of chatting with folks, and then I usually write grant proposals myself. Sometimes I show them to communities, sometimes I don't. If I have partners or people who are doing a lot of the work, obviously they get shown it and their names are on it. I have a 88% success rate in grant proposals, and I command, I think, $4.5 million. A lot. I am very good at telling stories in grants, and I will very much use terms like citizen science. I tend not to drop the word genocide in a science proposal because that's not going to get me the money to pay the folks, right? So I never lie, and I always use the terms in which my readers will be fluent and try and find where our values will resonate and come in contact. And that's what I tell the stories about, right? So yeah, that sort of success and that willingness to, so this idea of like selling out and I have to put the word genocide at the top of all of my NSF sort of stuff, that's not going to work because those folks can't hear those words without like dropping the page and having feelings. So sort of like being a grifter, right? Becoming fluent and circulating and passing and all those sorts of things that we know that a lot of us do, and not feeling dirty about those moves. But again, I don't lie. I try, and it's sort of like collaborating with really diverse groups where you try and find the high level value that we can all basically agree on and work there. And don't worry about everyone agreeing with genocide or anti-blackness or whatever, but still lift some of those goals and stuff up so the orientation is still that way, using terms and values that people are fluent in and can get on side with. That's what a grant application is. Translation and charisma.
So any chance you'd be willing to share the lab's ethical principles as outlined in the lab book?
Yeah, it's online. Our lab book is online. It'll be updated soon. The one that's up there is, I think, 3 years old, and the new one is way better stories in it, but they're online. And how we run a lab meeting is online. The part of, because a lot of people understand CLEAR as a model, I get lots and lots and lots of questions in my inbox about how to do it, more than I could ever answer, and also still do my various jobs. And so all of it is online at our website, like all of it. Like our data management is everything. So it's there for you.
Thanks. So the next question is a little bit longer, but it begins by acknowledging what I should have already, which is that we're on the Catawba Nation here, territory in the Appalachian foothills. And so the question then, so I've been reading and listening to recent talks by Joseph Robertson on Indigenous data sovereignty, and he discusses how some Indigenous nations are pursuing privatized data protection, so corporate data storage models, to prevent traditional tribal knowledges and specimens from being accessible through FOIA requests or various freedom of information type requests. Are there needs for these types of anti-colonial strategies to refuse or reject requests for sensitive knowledges in the form of work that you're doing?
Yep. So all of my projects, community science, citizen science, if they involve Indigenous groups or Indigenous land, always have an Indigenous data sovereignty contract that says, I don't own any of the data. And it's the Indigenous group who has access, let's see, OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession of that data. And I can use it if they give permission, but it isn't mine. I also, when I was administrator, created a university level Indigenous data sovereignty contract that anyone in the university can use in their research. There is a copy of it online for free. It's at Memorial under Indigenous research. So yeah, absolutely. And this is crucial in part of the resource relationship and sort of changing the terms and the power relations of those relationships is data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty. So good question.
So the question from a student who's interested in going into this kind of work, how have you managed to build your identity and skills as a researcher spanning across these different fields and epistemologies?
I build my, a lot of translation work. So there's a lot of skills you get as a white passing Indigenous person or any kind of person who is understood by dominant society to not quite fit in academia or other places. Code switching, there's a bunch of terms for it, grifting, hustling, there's a bunch of different things. And those skills are directly applicable into research and university. Sort of like when I was talking about grant applications, that's hustle. And that's what you learn selling knives door to door, which is what I used to do as a kid. Super sketchy now that I think about it. So yeah, so being intentional, when you can find mentors, find safe spaces or safer spaces, and who cares what they get up to in those safer spaces. A lot of the people in my lab were never interested in plastics, but they're just trans in science or something like this, and they found a home in the lab, right? Now they work on plastics and anti-colonial science. So trying to maneuver your way and find those little spots of respite, trying to find your connections, and yeah, not feeling guilty when you need to code switch or translate into something that is safer and more legible to various power relations. I am not a good model. I started in art and no, I started in science and I dropped out and went into art, which I dropped out and went into media studies. And then I leveraged that into sociology. And now I'm in a geography department. I don't recommend that route because you have to learn so many disciplines and you don't get to go out at night when you're reading and trying to learn a new discipline. But yeah, part of the reason I got a job, even though I have degrees that don't match up very well, is part of this translation work and this storytelling and trying to find the values that I have in a discipline have in common and then telling stories at that juncture. So people recognize it and are like, oh yeah, that's what I work on too. Oh yeah, that's what I care about too. Yeah. I mean, look, there are 128 of you. Somehow something made you come into this room, right? So finding those spots where things come together is a huge part of that.
So on a different topic then, so you have to pay for work and you only have so much money. How do you justify or make those choices about who gets paid?
Prioritization. So this is a, I mean, it sounds cheeky, but I mean, if you've been poor all life, you know how it goes. You have to prioritize certain things. You do fewer projects with fewer people in fewer places, but damn, are they good, right? My point about Jess being an exceptional worker because she could transform our protocols to fit place better, that practice like skyrocketed our lab and my career because people are just better when you pay them and they're in place. So the fact that we did fewer smaller projects didn't matter to my career because of that. When you have very few resources, priority becomes very important and you can't have 17 priorities. That's why our lab has 3 value priorities or values that orient things, because if we had 17, it wouldn't work very well. Sorry if that's an unsatisfying answer.
So before I ask the next question, I should tell everyone and remind everyone, if you got here late, that this is being recorded and the center will put it up on its YouTube channel as soon as it's usually a few days. If you go to ethics.uncc.edu, there's a little YouTube button on the upper right. The YouTube channel's name is about that long with lots of letters, which I can't remember, so that's the best way to get there. So the question then, and so can you speak to what seemed like a conflict between indigenous communities seeking access to prestigious accredited science for their own anti-colonial purposes and the goal of decentering capital S science? It would seem the goal would be to follow community struggles and demands, but that could take us towards reifying capital S science as a standard for speaking truth with the colonial baggage that entails.
Yeah, so that's the what I would call compromised terrain, and this basically what my book is about. You got some crappy inheritances. There's no terra nullius, there's no clean slate from which to start this. So how do you maneuver those compromises ethically? How do you maneuver this compromise, sticky, what did you call it? Contradictory space in a good way? And that's really hard. And that's why I had to write a whole book, which doesn't give answers, but sort of get some orientations. So one of the orientations to that is what the Indigenous group wants is what the Indigenous group gets, right? That's what sovereignty is. And they can want things that are not your cup of tea or that you think is like, oh, that's a little bit colonial. Well, fuck, of course it is. They were colonized. Some of that's going to be a little colonial, right? And you don't correct them. You just go with gusto. So I have a couple of partnerships with Indigenous groups where, yeah, they want capitalist science. And of course they do. It's really good science, but they also want really good knowledge production, but they also want other kinds of knowledge production, much of which isn't any of my business. And also my job is to make myself obsolete by the time I leave, which means all of my knowledge, all of my skills, all of my equipment, and all of my money is left in that community. So if they want to work with me again, they can, but they don't need to work with me because they could do capitalist science themselves, which will of course look different from that place. That's one way to maneuver it. There are obviously others.
Cool. So I've noticed an increase in grant-making organizations focused on work in places like the Arctic requiring demonstration of community involvement in the pre-proposal stage, when the research, which seems like a well-meaning incentivization of inclusion, whereas the result is a massive inundation of requests for partnership and research for Indigenous communities, where those requests for attention to the researcher constitute labor. Do you have a vision for how funders could build the appropriate doors, to use your analogy, while not inadvertently creating a new burden for affected communities?
Yeah, so when I was an administrator, I made a program like that. So what I did was I created a group of settler scientists and researchers, social scientists, humanities folks, who were already really good at that work and were identified as community as being good at that work. And researchers have to go to that settler group first to get taught how you don't cold call communities in the Arctic, and you have to do your homework. And actually ITK already wrote that report. And also there's this thing called Indigenous data sovereignty, right? To take the labor off of the Indigenous groups and place it back sort of within the academic and non-Indigenous, although there are obviously Indigenous academics, sort of move that. Also, I told a bunch of nations that were struggling with, like you said, the inundation of labor of these well-intentioned requests to charge people for their requests, like France does. So if I want to do research in France, I got to pay, like, I forget what it is, like some number 100 of francs or euro to even make the request. That means you can pay people to do that labor, and that labor is now paid. And also people who haven't done their homework yet are either rich and will spend the money or will do their homework before they pay the fee, right? So there's different structural things like that. I do think it's right that grantors are like, oh, wait, you can't just go to the Arctic and do things because that's a homeland and you should have buy-in from the community. But you're right, that deals with the problem, but also shifts it down a smidge. But I still think it's a good direction. And it's a direction a lot of the Indigenous communities in the Arctic that I work with, which honest to God are only in the Eastern Arctic. I don't know what is happening in the rest of the Arctic. It's a big place, but that's what they're asking for too.
All right, I have now, I think, exhausted the chat box. I hope I've honored everyone's questions and not brutalized them too badly when I paraphrase. Did anybody else have any other thoughts or questions for Max?
That's cool. I need a break.
So it looks like there are some thank yous showing up in chat. It looks like you may have earned your release here. So let me, yeah, and one of them says, we're looking forward to the book, and I think I definitely agree with that. And you said it's out when?
It's out at the end of the month, but Duke always puts the introduction online for free. So the first, and it's a short book, so the first quarter of the book is already online for free at Duke University Press.
Excellent. Yeah, so we're all going to go pre-order that. Thank you so much for the talk. This is wonderful, and I think I can. Yeah, if I don't know if you can see the chat, but they're scrolling through. So thank you.
Thank you. I can't see the chat, so I'll take your word for it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All
Thank you
right.
everyone for coming. Thank you. Oh, I see the claps. You can clap and I'll see it. Thanks, folks.